Hello everybody and welcome to the weekend. Much needed weekend. It has been a long week. In fact, it has been a long couple of weeks thanks to an awful lot of really good games getting released in a very short span of time. Just yesterday I reviewed Katana Kami, and then a couple of weeks ago, if that, there was a Hatsune Miku game which has chewed up a lot of my time. There have been a couple of games from Idea Factory. I am in the process of playing Nippon Ichi Epic for review, and over on PC World there's a game that has come out called World of Horror. It's in early access at the moment, so I won't have a full review, but I am going to do a write-up of it because it is absolutely amazing in the state that it's already in. It is one very, very clever Lovecraftian style Junji Ito homage horror game, and I highly recommend looking into that. And you should read my review or my coverage when I get it up as well. But for all of that, I'm going to have a very long weekend this weekend as well, thanks to Nippon Ichi, thanks to Koei Tecmo, because Koei Tecmo has released the latest in its Romance of the Three Kingdoms series, and as anybody who has played one of these games know, they are time sinks. In the best possible way, of course, and I do love them, but they are time sinks. I haven't actually had the chance to play it enough to get a review done for when embargo lifts. That is later on today as I record this. But what I will do is share some footage of the first couple of hours of play of a campaign that I'm doing, and from there I'll discuss what I love about the Romance of the Three Kingdoms series, because this is not the first game in that series that I have fell in love with. But after that, early next week, I'll get a review up once I've had a chance to sit down with it over the weekend, because I imagine that this is what I'm going to be spending all my weekend doing. The problem with doing a video on a strategy game is that they're not the most dynamic of video games, let's put it that way. It's a lot of static looking at maps and wading through menus and making decisions, and then watching that stuff play out in a kind of a slow pace, because you need to be strategic, you need to take your time, and Romance of the Three Kingdoms certainly demands that you are very strategic. But what I'll do with this video is, like I said, this is the first couple of hours of a campaign, so it's not too complex at this stage. There's not too many units on the map, there's not too many territories in play, and I don't need to split my attention into too many different places. And it'll give you a sense, I guess, of the early game strategy and the very basics of the mechanics, and I'll talk you through some of those as I play as well. Not that I particularly want to be a tutorial. I don't want to use this video as a way of introducing you to the game. Thankfully, Romance of the Three Kingdoms XIV actually has a very good tutorial system, and the systems that Koei Tecmo have designed are quite accessible. This series has been difficult to get into in the past for people, where some other strategy games, like Civilization being the great example, have really tried to be accessible and then give you depth as after you'd got your feet wet. Romance of the Three Kingdoms really used to like to throw you in the deep end from the start, and it was a struggle for a lot of people. I think this game will be better as an introduction to the series for a lot of people. Right away it's quite accessible. Like I said, there's a good tutorial, and it's a tutorial that doesn't take too long to play through. You'll be pretty much across everything that you need to play this game within the first hour or so of play, and that's an impressive effort, because it doesn't sacrifice any of the depth either. Already I'm finding plenty of strategic depth in this game, and I think that it's only going to continue to reward me as I play on and get more in depth with its systems. So the way that Romance of the Three Kingdoms works is actually quite simple to explain. It takes a lot to master, of course, but it is quite simple in its very basic form. It is a turn-based game, but everybody takes their turn at the same time. So if you're used to more casually orientated strategy games like Civilization, for example, where you'll take a turn, your opponents will take a turn, and then you'll respond to whatever your opponents have done. In this one, you need to all take your turns at the same time. You'll set up your commands for your units, you'll tell them where to go, you'll tell them what to do, whether it's to build defensive structures in an area, capture cities, attack enemy units, whatever. You'll also have to set up your commanders orders in the cities, telling them to focus on training troops or improving the town's economy or its farmland. You'll also need to set up diplomacy. You might want to try and make peace with an enemy, for example, by sending them gifts and all that. You do all of that in the menus between turns. And then you hit the big left button on the screen, and then all of your commands play out over the course of a month of in-game time. And as that happens, you're quite limited in what you can do yourself. You can only really watch what's going on. So there is an element there where you need to predict what your opponent's doing. Otherwise you can get caught by surprise. They might send a unit on a roundabout route to attack you from behind. They might try a pincer move with a couple of different units, and you need to read your movements of your opponents before they've set the commands so that you can compensate and you can avoid getting caught out. The scenario I'm playing is the first scenario in the game, which is the Yellow Turban Rebellion, which is a particularly good scenario for getting the hang of Romance of the Three Kingdoms. The Yellow Turban faction, which is the yellow land that you're seeing on the screen there, they are quite powerful at the start. They have a big numbers advantage, but they're at war with absolutely everybody. So my faction, which is the Wu, I always pick the Wu because Lady Sun is a character from the Wu faction, and therefore they are the best. There is no debate there. They don't have the resources that the Yellow Turbans start with initially, but they don't have to deal with enemies attacking them from every side. So it's a good one for getting a feel for the strategy of the game, the fact that you can't simply overwhelm your opponent with numbers. You need to use sabotage, you need to use defensive buildings, and you need to be quite efficient with the strategy. You'll learn all of that in the context of this particular scenario, which means that once you get to the more complex scenarios where you need to deal with diplomacy, multiple enemies, alliances, all of that kind of stuff, you're in a much better position to get a hang of all of that. So like I said earlier in the video, this Romance of the Three Kingdoms is actually quite accessible for newcomers, and the reason is quite simple. It's the menu system. Earlier Romance of the Three Kingdoms games had so many menus to work through, and every menu had multiple options within it, sub-menus, and you needed to understand how every single thing in the game worked in order to build a cohesive strategy. If you didn't really master everything, you were going to get swamped by the enemy in some way or other, because the AI, even on the lower difficulty levels, understood how the menu system worked and understood how the systems worked, and kind of effectively exploited it and beat you for overlooking something. And if you had the patience to slowly learn every single part of those systems, then you could really get into the game and love it for what it offered. Whereas most people just did not have that kind of patience. Romance of the Three Kingdoms 14 really does a good job of streamlining everything. So as you see, the main menu only has 5 options, and the number of sub-menus within that are quite limited. The game uses the commanders to give you heaps of advice on what you should do next, and it's good advice. It's so you can pay attention to that when you're still learning the systems and make quite good progress and feel like you're getting the hang of what strategies are on offer in the game. And it's all just very clean, and like I said, the tutorial is actually very useful as well, and quite brief. No one likes to do a really long tutorial. No one likes to work through 4 or 5 hours before they even get into the game proper. This one doesn't sacrifice any of the depth, and that means to an extent there is still a lot of complexity in there, but it also finds that right balance where it's still accessible as a complex strategy game. The thing that will be really interesting for me is how this game performs now that there's some genuine competition on the market, because beforehand Romance of the Three Kingdoms was pretty much a lock on the Romance of the Three Kingdoms as a setting for strategy games. But as of last year, Total War came in with Total War Three Kingdoms and did a really good job. It's a very good strategy game in its own right. It's not the grand strategy that this one is, in that Total War is more about the on-field battle tactics and stuff like that, and the kind of management of the empire is less of a main feature in the game, whereas in this one, the management of the Empire is basically everything that the game is, and the battling systems are quite streamlined and simplified, even compared to other games in the Romance series. But even with that difference, there is still going to be the perception that these two games are in direct competition. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how it plays out. If you're a fan of history, I do think that Romance of the Three Kingdoms is still going to appeal to you in a way that Total War doesn't. While Total War obviously took the names and the history and made sure that it was authentic in that respect, it doesn't quite have the same level of focus on the game. So if you're not a fan of Chinese history, or particularly Romance of the Three Kingdoms, then you'll play without really paying too much attention to what one general's name is, what one country's name is, or whatever. Whereas with this one, that storytelling side of things is basically everything. And when I say storytelling, I don't mean cutscenes, although there are a few of those as well. What I actually mean is the little kind of stories you write for yourself based on your knowledge of the books and whatever. So Sun Tzu, for example, when he becomes, the leader of the Wu, using him in battle has a certain resonance to it because of that character portrait, because of that name, and because of that role in history that he played. And I think that in focusing really heavily on the characters and stuff, Romance of the Three Kingdoms perhaps does have a little bit more of a limited appeal than Total War, because not that many people have actually read the book or particularly care about it. But that I feel like that this is the kind of game that you can get much more passionately attached to, because if you do happen to like Romance of the Three Kingdoms as the book and the history, then this game is a much more genuine attempt to do something with that history. Also, I really do love the presentation of this game. It looks simple, I know, but the hexagons are great. I grew up playing the Avalon Hill board games like War and Peace and whatever, and as such I've always associated hexagons with strategy. It's just an aesthetic thing. Like when I see hexagons on a map, I just assume that I'm going to have pieces to move around them, and it's going to be some kind of military history that I'm playing. So they've done a good job with creating that immediate association, because you actually earn territory one hexagon at a time. You can actually see your empire growing at a rate which feels quite good, even if you play on the slower pacing, which I tend to do because I like to really concentrate as I'm playing, rather than kind of fly through even sections where there's not as much happening. Even when you play on the slowest pace, you still see your empire kind of growing or contracting if you're under attack every turn, and that has there's a nice fluidity about that. So the fluidity with which the borders are moving in Romance of the Three Kingdoms really does a good job of, again, staying true to the actual books, because if you read the book, you would know that the borders are very fluid. Every battle would change the kind of face of China entirely, and that it's subtle. It's a subtle way of kind of reflecting that, but I think the team at Koei Tecmo have done a really good job in recognizing that that is part of the appeal of Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and finding a way of replicating that in this game. The other great thing about this particular series for me is that it has always been designed for console first. So while this particular title is getting a release on PC at the same time as the console release, the console version doesn't feel like the developers have struggled to find some kind of way of making it work. It wasn't long ago where basically strategy games, especially serious strategy games, weren't being released on console at all. In the early era PS3, for example, the PS2, early era PS3, Koei Tecmo stopped localizing Romance of the Three Kingdoms and Nobunaga's Ambition, and because Koei had pulled out of it, Civilization wasn't going on there, Total War has never been a kind of console release, and the Paradox stuff never really got console releases either. So as a strategy game fan, I was always kind of left out of the loop unless I was willing to play stuff on PC. This game works very nicely on console. The button maps are great. The design interface is fine. So that's a nice touch as well, which I've always appreciated with this series. And yeah, good on Koei for that. And finally, I've got to say there's a lot of contents in this game. There's a lot of scenarios to play even before you delve into the DLC stuff. If you buy the game, I think day one, or if you pre-ordered it, or you buy a special edition, you get some extra scenarios. They're unnecessary. Even if you just play the base game, there are a lot of scenarios to work through. And those scenarios are effectively limitless because you can take control of any of the factions in the game. And as you do that, as you can see right there, that's a lot of different maps, different scenarios that you can put yourself in. You could try to be the Yellow Turban, rebellion, and turn it into a full revolution that's actually successful. And that's, of course, a big part of the appeal of historical strategy games, is trying to reverse the history. Or you can play as your favorite faction. If you're anything like me, you like to play as the underdog quite often, which really ups the difficulty level and forces you to kind of replay over and over until you finally lock into the strategy that will get you there. Anyway, that's enough of this. Look forward to my review early next week. Thanks for watching this rather long video. Hope you enjoyed it. Please do like and subscribe if you enjoy my videos, and please do consider backing me on Patreon, because that helps. Thanks again for watching. Have a great weekend whatever you're playing, and we will see you next week.